Thanks, John, for moderating. That was fabulous. So now we have the need for open and fair markets for software and hardware. Because repair is not only a consumer issue, but a broader B2B issue, particularly when it comes to big business like airlines, banks, and access to software and hardware repair, service and maintenance. So now we're joined online by Thomas O'Leary from Ireland, who's been an avid campaigner against the lock-in practices that can dominate the technology industry. Hi, Thomas. I'll hand to you.
Thank you very much. I had some challenges there, technology. Good here today. I have some slides. I don't know if they're going to appear on the screen. Hopefully they are, and hope you're all enjoying the afternoon. Hope you're getting good weather where you are. Sadly, where I am in the world, it's a rainy summer. I'm sure you saw your cricket team taking advantage of that only a few weeks ago in Manchester, but obviously in Dublin, Ireland, it's a bit of a rainy summer here, sadly. Yes, 15 minutes. So I know you've had some very good presentations earlier today, talking about what's going on in Europe from other perspectives, and what's going on. One of my colleagues from the US, a friend of mine, Kyle, was on as well this morning, I believe. So I'm not going to go into some of the details. I would like to give you a perspective on what we'd like, what free ICT is, and what it is we're trying to do, and some of the things that are happening in it from a business perspective, and our approach from a legislative perspective in Europe, but predominantly, and a little bit on what's happening in the US, because I know you have some of that already. So I'll just kick off with who we are, Free ICT Europe. Free ICT, what we're about is representing organizations who are the third-party maintainers, used IT brokers, refurbishers, used software resellers, software third-party maintainers, organizations who are involved in the leasing and rental and repair of digital and disposal of digital assets. Okay. Predominantly in the hardware space, but significantly and more recently also in the software space. And principally what we're about is creating a environment of fair play, a fair play that will allow us as human beings on this planet to have and create a sustainable future. So today is all about the circular economy, and we're trying to understand, is the circular economy really at the center of everything that we're doing in business today, and in our IT decisions that we're making? So technology decisions that we're making in our organizations, whether it be a private sector or a public sector organization. And that answer I would give you is that no, it's not. We have a significant problem, and from the way we like to describe it is, and you may have heard some of this terminology earlier today, is this decoupling that we need to instigate, and this change in the measurement system that we use for what is good. Okay, so in economies we measure GDP. It's economic activity. It's all about driving more. It's about driving growth at almost all costs, and we need to decouple that certainly from resource use, and absolutely need to decouple this from environmental impact. There may well need to be at some point a brand new measurement system, because the measurement system we have today may just not be appropriate anymore, and that may be for another day, and that's another debate. But ultimately, I think what we really need to do is we need to decouple from the economic activity, the amount of resources that we use in technology. And if we look at the way technology deployment used to be done, okay, and still is to a certain extent, but traditionally technology in businesses, it was always about buying the new, all right? That was traditionally what happened, and all the technology, the big tech companies, was all about pushing the new products and new services on us, and the consumption was about buying new. Okay, and very little was around sharing, very little about some refurbishment. Of course, we like to use things a little bit longer, mostly because we were almost forced to use them longer, and we always wanted something new. We see this in our consumer business, in our personal lives all the time. I'm sure you like yourselves. I've just been away on holidays with my children, and they were wanting the latest for Christmas. They were talking about what they want from Santa, and the latest technology is almost always the latest version of the technology. So it's built into our psyche as consumers. It's built into our psyche as human beings, and it's certainly built into our psyche as business leaders. And technology buyers in businesses need to start thinking about this stuff differently. We need a new deal. There are just not enough resources on the planet to feed our demand into the future. So we have to find a new way. And that's going to include, obviously, more and more sharing of technology, whether that's cloud-based. It's going to include a lot more refurbishment. And it's going to really include, this is really something I want to get across, is it's going to require us to keep things we have far longer. And this is probably one of the big points that we try to make in our business, in our approach to talk, when we talk to businesses and when we talk to legislators, both in Brussels and more recently in Washington, D.C., about what it is we want legislators to focus in on. I'd like to talk you through some of the things so these are just examples of things we think the future, so it's no longer going to be as business as usual. Of course, it's important to put here what we're saying to legislators and to you in the audience and to businesses. This is a mix. So this is not one size fits all. We're not about coming in and saying it has to be one way or another way. This is actually saying this needs to be a mix. So what can organizations do? Well, starting off from the position of organizations need to think about the technology that they've deployed in their businesses and think about extending the life of the hardware and software that they currently use. That's it, period. It's the first thing you stop thinking about always having to make a change. And make sure your procurement strategies and processes allow for this, all right? That there's not this automatic click in that you have to replace things at a certain period. Stop those policies now and look at them and see are they appropriate going forward. Have environments, for example, where you cascade and redeploy old equipment across your environment, where you may need a lower computing use, for example, in a different area. So reuse within your organization before you make any other changes. And please do not make any unnecessary software upgrades. Ask yourself real questions here. Why am I making these changes? Who is in control of those decisions I make in my business? So, do you need to make the upgrades? Do you need to make the changes? Or are they being driven through some marketing effort or some changes within the organization that have sold you the software or the hardware in the first place? If you need to buy a product, and of course you should, and that's part of the mix, but actually think about, can we have a first focus on, is it possible to buy used or refurbished options, and push back on these end of support, end of life dates that are honestly arbitrary and fictitious in most cases. They're driven by the big tech organizations making decisions independent to us. That's it, period. And we need to change that. And they're independent things are made because of the economic model that exists, all right? And that again goes back to what I said earlier. Maybe we need to make a change there. It's a longer conversation, but ultimately it starts with us as individuals and businesses to say, no, we don't accept that those end of life changes should apply. What is driving that? And genuinely focus on some of these things. When you're buying, of course, choose to buy. Some of the recommendations we make to procurement organizations. Choose to buy from manufacturers that score highly on repairability, highly on energy efficiency, and material usage. And there's lots and lots of legislation. I'm sure you heard earlier from some of the speakers what is happening in Europe. So I'm not going to go into those details. So good legislation happening both in Europe, and conversations similar, obviously, happening in the US on this topic. And ensure there's no obstacles, by the way, to independent third-party support, or even looking after these things yourself. That there's no software lock-ins, and there's no contractual terms. You'd be surprised the number of contractual terms that exist in the paperwork on the click that you make, that says you cannot do certain things without the permission of the manufacturer. The fact that you can't maybe just resell it without the permission, because the owners, the user rights remain with the big tech company that made it in the first place. These are terms and conditions that actually shouldn't be in there in the first place. And when they're drawn to the attention of legislators, we see this in Brussels, we see this in Washington as well, they are actually, they're surprisingly unsurprised, but also really annoyed. Okay, so really annoyed because they said, I guess it's blatantly obvious that this stuff exists and it shouldn't exist, and they know that they've been asleep at the wheel in some respects. And increasingly, let's not contribute more to the e-waste problem. We need to start thinking about these things differently, and of course, understand the terms and conditions of the technology you're buying. And this is really hard, and this is a big space where we spend a lot of time talking to partners in Brussels and in Washington about what is it what we can do to simplify some of these things. The tech companies love to make these things more complicated, and they're very good at that. So understand your rights as best you can, and seek help where you need help. Great news is we started our free ICT in 2014, and really people were kind of got the message when we first started knocking on door, when we first started in Europe. Business is really, green. Evergreening was a term used by the industry to replace stuff forever. It's crazy. So this is a term that they use, evergreening, to say, oh yes, every 3 years, replace your technology. You're greening your landscape. You're not greening your landscape. But businesses really, that's what they were hearing. Now we start to see things that are really exciting. For example, the GSMA, who are a global organization that represents all of the mobile carriers, including the ones in Australia, Telstra and Optus, they've got together and they're taking action. And they're talking about doing certain things that is suggesting for their network equipment across the globe, keep your current equipment for active use for longer. Exactly what I was telling you from the beginning. Share network infrastructure, develop awareness of circular economy across the industry, and a whole range of other similar recommendations that I just talked to you about earlier. Okay, so it's great to see this from specific parts of the industry, large consumers of technology, realizing actually this is totally unsustainable going forwards. These are not sustainable models. And in the last 12 months, we've seen spin up in the United States an organization called sustainableIT.org. It's like the veritable who's who of CIOs of huge organizations in the United States. And they have, so you should check out the website. Some great comments here. I really hope that this thing can take some legs. But they're saying that they believe sustainability has been someone else's problem for far too long. And that's the challenge. We've been looking around saying we are passengers on this ship and who else is going to look after this? But the reality is we are the crew. We are the crew, and only we can actually make changes that are going to be that are going to make a difference. Legislators have taken action. Okay, legislators have taken action. You probably know a little bit about this from previous speakers. Perhaps you don't. I'll send this on, but this is specifically on servers and storage. It came into effect in 2001. I'm not going to go into the details of this, other than to say that it is forcing manufacturers to comply in Europe. Certain categories of servers and storage. So it's a little bit restrictive. Okay, it's not as wide as we'd like it. And that's one of the challenges with legislation. It ends up being very narrow in ecosystems when we want it to actually be quite broad. And the problem when it's too broad, though, you've got to be careful. Do you have unwittingly bring things in that you didn't intend to, and some unintended consequences. But ultimately, it's meaning that products that are shipped down in Europe have a much obligation on manufacturers to make sure products can be around for far longer, and that the security patches, that fixes, that firmware are available either free of charge or a fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory way. Where are we going next? So I'm going to talk specifically in the EU. In the EU, as an organization, we're talking obviously the EU, that EU needs to be an open market, not an OEM controlled ecosystem. We're really focusing on networking equipment. There's no rules around this at all. It wasn't included in the eco-design ESPR legislation last time around. So that's been that we're trying to get that on the table, because it's a big product being used and shipped, and that products that actually really should have much longer life cycle. They just don't have as many moving parts as other technology stacks, and the software does not need to be changed as frequently. It's mostly related to security and some performance issues. We want to remove the black box, this concept around software that it's the digital keys and using intellectual property rights all the time to say, oh no, you can't do this, you can't do that. We want to push back on that. In Europe, the majority of reply to repair conversation is around consumers, when the reality is over 60% of spend and impact on the market is in B2B. So by ignoring the B2B sector, they're leaving over 60% of that market behind. And that message is starting to take hold. This product as a service idea that's going to fix everything, we're warning to be careful. Doesn't necessarily fix everything. We're seeing in some cases, for example, PC as a service actually creating higher waste. It's not a sustainable model necessarily, so it needs to be looked at. Obviously, the non-financial reporting angle, creating standards that we're working with organizations in that space to look at standards like the ISO organization, and ultimately, we're getting great success in involving end users as we just talked about earlier, in the fight in this area as well. Finally, just to wrap up, and sorry I'm running a little bit late, what are we saying? The biggest challenges is obviously clearly reduced materials and the consumption of new. The EU does now see the IT aftermarket as an alternative to the big tech industry. Networking hardware and software regulation are the top priority for policymakers now, and that's thanks to a lot of the work that we've done. And remember, independent, small and medium-sized enterprises are the experts in extending life. That's just the way it is. Big organizations tend not to be, despite the fact that they can make a lot more noise about it. It's the small and medium-sized organizations and the backbone of many economies. And what we require is for change. We're looking for people to make strategic choices, better plans, and as you say here in Ireland, put on some big boy pants and in the end user organizations and the large IT outsourcers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate that. I know that you're away on holidays. I think it's really important to have you part of our dialogue here in Australia, because often Right to Repair is really focused on a consumer issues. So it's lovely to have you here and broaden this. It really is a business-to-business issue and really affecting really large industries. So do we have any questions for Tomas? I'll just wait for a microphone. Just in the front here for Danny. Thank you. We have Danny Ellis from Mended Australia. Tomas?
How are you, Thomas? Just a question on software subscriptions. It's coming into all parts of the motor car, gym equipment. You get appliances that you subscribe to, and then they withdraw the service, and you've got an appliance or e-waste just sitting on your bench. What can be done there to sort of maybe change the thinking for the consumer to fight back with that there?
It's a tricky one, because there is a view within legislators in general that this sharing economy is a good thing. Well, I think it's about ultimately looking at intellectual property rights and in the longer term. But in the shorter term, it's about focusing in on speaking to legislators, making them aware that some of the conditions around the use of the technology. So it is a good thing in some parts. Economically, it can be, where you have software as a service that you pay when you want, just what you use, and then you stop using. The issue comes about anything that you might own or you might have done. So you get nothing back, okay? So if you've any data that you have, you're actually giving that up all the time. So I think it's focused on what are you contributing back. So like as if you just come back from holidays, as Leanne said, if I left something in the car, it's mine. I can take it with me. All right. I give them back their car. I put back the fuel that I consumed, but that's it. And I pay for the rental of the car. And I think we have to get into a different mindset around this. What's happened traditionally is that many of these things have been ignored. And a lot of the conditions, there's sneaky terms and conditions put into these products, both at consumer and business level. Right, and some of the really sneaky ones are worse in business, by the way, and they're going to come to consumers next, because that's often what happens. And so I think we need to talk to legislators and make them aware of this and create a fairer landscape. And I think it starts with making sure that we understand what are we giving away, and that we get some value in return for that. And now, I don't think there's none of these things there's no easy solution to any of these things, and you may have to look at it case by case or group by group. All right. But I would start, perhaps the easiest one is look at data and say, okay, I'm giving my data there. What do I get in return? All right. It's certainly this, if you don't get something economically, I get some rights back. And that's what I'd be looking at.
The thing on about too, Thomas, is that like I'll just use Foxtel for an example. You get a box, you get a remote, your subscription's finished, and they all end up down in e-waste. So would it be a good idea for the Foxtel to remains the property of Foxtel? When your subscription finishes, they take it back, then they can send it off to the next customer that wants to use it. It just seems such a total waste of resource.
Total waste, and it can't be economically sustainable either. It's absolutely crazy. So you're right. A lot of this is about habits, though. These organisations do these things because they've always done them. You go to your local medical unit, and because of the health issues in Ireland, for example, you can't bring crutches back if you break your leg. It's absolutely crazy that they don't take these things back. But ultimately, if they're not taking them back, then legislators need to put some rules in place, and that's their job. That's the job of legislators, to create a landscape for people to actually because it's not sustainable. Look at the amount of e-waste that's happening out there. That's what we need to focus on, and change some of those habits and change some of those behaviours. We need to put pressure on, as consumers, we need to put pressure on these businesses, and we put pressure on our policymakers.
Thank you, Thomas. That's a really great point, and that's exactly why we're all meeting here today for our third Australian Repair Summit, is really to put pressure on our regulators and policymakers to pay attention to these issues. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you again for joining us.